Hey team, we're going to learn how to add passwordless login and authentication to a Next.js app with Clerk. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. This video is brought to you and sponsored by Clerk. Clerk is a total user management solution that gives you a ton of tools and integrations to easily add it into your app. Its login and authentication SDKs work with all the tools that you already love to use, like Next.js, Gatsby, Remix, or even just vanilla React. If you're ready to get started, head over to Clerk at spacejelly.dev/clerk and start building for free. So diving in, we're going to get started with passwordless authentication. And what do I mean by passwordless? That means, well, you don't have to add, use, or manage a password in order to log into your Clerk account. So we can use things like social SSO, where we can sign up with whatever account we want to add that Clerk supports, or with email and SMS passcodes, where we're going to enable email for our use case, but this is a way that you can send a verification code whenever somebody wants to log in and easily get them access into their account very quickly. So like I mentioned before, we're going to use Clerk with Next.js, which if you're not familiar with Next.js, it's a React framework that's going to give us an easy way to spin up a new application and get super productive with Clerk. To do this, I have a demo starter project that I created that's going to get us up and running with a very simple UI so that we can all start off at the same place. But if you want to follow along with your own project, that's fine too. It's just going to be a simple application that has a page built separately that I want to protect with a password. Now, if you are following along, you can find this repository over on my GitHub, or you can also find it in the YouTube video description. But I'm going to scroll down on the page and we can see we have this command yarn create next app, or you can use npx if you prefer npm. But I'm going to copy this and I'm going to head over to my terminal. I'm going to paste it in, and then afterwards, I'm going to specify the project name, and let's call this my Clerk, if I spell it right, app. What this is going to do is Next.js is going to clone down this repository that I created. It's going to install all the dependencies, and it's even going to reset the Git history so that we have a fresh new starting place for getting started. But once it's ready, I can now cd into that new directory. And just to show what we're starting with, I can run yarn dev or npm run dev if you're using npm. I'm going to now open this local host up in my new tab, and we can see once it loads, I have this TV tracker application that I set up that's really going to give us a bunch of static data that I preloaded in the project, including some randomized TV shows on the front page. But we also have this page that if you click login, it's going to give us this dashboard page, which again, this is just a bunch of static data, but it gives you a feel of what it would look like if we're actually providing an application that you have to log in to see your own stats. So as you might have suspected, what we want to do is we want to prevent people from being able to access that dashboard page. So to do that, we're going to lock it down with a password. And to get in, we're going to use passwordless solutions, including the social login, as well as the verification token. Now, we're not going to dive in too deep into the intricacies of Next.js itself. You can find a video above if you want to check that out, but we're going to try to see what we're actually working with. So if I look inside the source directory, we can see that I have some components. These are just some things I pre-filled out. We have the data, which is a bunch of TV show data that's provided by TV Maze API, which you can find the link in the description. And we also have this pages directory, which is going to be our homepage and our dashboard. And really all this is a React component essentially that's dumping out all that data from the TV shows that I provided. But what we're going to do is we have this dashboard page, and this is where we're going to actually lock it down. Now, first things first, in order to actually use Clerk, we want to make sure that we have our account set up. So again, make sure you head over to spacejelly.dev/clerk and sign up for your free account. But once you do, we'll be met with our new dashboard where we can see that we can add an application. So I'm going to click add application, and we can see we can specify a name. So I'm going to call it TV Tracker, which is what my application is called. You can use whatever you want for your application name, but then we can see that we have some options for how we actually configure our account. Now we have some standard authentication methods, such as we can use an email address for somebody to log in, which is completely fine. We can use a phone number or username if we want. So I'm going to just leave it at email address for now. But authentication strategy, as you might imagine, we want it to be passwordless. So I'm going to go ahead and select passwordless so that we don't have to have our users actually deal with any passwords at all. But then we can see we have two other options for how we can connect accounts, where we have the social login, where I'm going to keep Google selected. I'm going to also select Twitter. And we can see that if we click show more, we have a bunch of other ones that we can support as well, including GitHub, if you want your users to have access to the account with GitHub. We also have Web3 authentication, which I'm not going to cover today, but it's pretty cool to see that that's available within Clerk. But if I scroll down, I'm going to simply click finish. And at this point, it's going to create that account for me, and I'm dropped in with some confetti to my new account. Now, as you can see right on this page, we can see some quick links in order to get started with the project that we want. And we're going to use Next.js. So I'm going to go ahead and click this, but you can also find these links inside of the documentation. Up at the top of the page under Get Help, if you click that and find the Read Documentation link, you can navigate your way over to the same quick starts and tutorials or general API references that we're going to walk through. But over on the page for getting started with Next.js, we're going to scroll down where we already created the app that we wanted to create, but we want to now install the Clerk SDK. So we can see here, this gives us the npm install command. I'm going to just copy the package name because I'm currently using Yarn. But then if I open up my terminal, I'm going to add yarn, add, and that package name, and I'm going to add it right to my project. Once that's finished, I'm going to head back to the docs where we can see that we need to add 3 separate API keys. We have the public Clerk frontend API, we have the API key itself, which means the next public is going to allow it to be used inside the client, where the API key and the JWT key, those are going to be kept secret and only going to be available on server rendered functionality. So we want to make sure that we keep those secret. But what we're going to do is, instead of running each of these commands, we're going to go ahead and just create our env.local file so that we can add them in ourselves. So back inside of our project, in the root of the directory, I'm going to create that new file .env.local, and this is where we're going to have all of our environment variables. So starting at the top with next public Clerk frontend API, I'm going to copy that key, paste it into my .env local, where we're going to add that value in a second. But for now, I'm just going to stub out all of those different variables so that we can go ahead and easily add them once we find where those keys are inside of our Clerk dashboard. Now, to find those keys inside of our home dashboard, we can scroll down on the left side where we see under developers, we have API keys. And as soon as we click there, we can see that we have all that information that we need. So starting from the top again, we have our front end API key, which I'm going to copy, head back over to my .env.local and paste that in. And I'm going to do the same thing for my backend API, where I'm going to paste that in the API key, and then my JWT key, which I'm going to copy that and paste that as well. So I have all my .env.local variable names already set. So next up in the getting started, we have the ClerkProvider, which we're going to use inside of our app.js file, which is going to allow us to access the Clerk context from wherever we want inside of the application. So for instance, if we want to add login or have a specific component only show if it's logged in, we're going to be able to do that because we're wrapping it with that ClerkProvider, which is taking advantage of that React context. So I'm going to copy this import statement where I'm going to import my ClerkProvider from Clerk Next.js. I'm going to head over to my code base, under source, and then under pages, or if your pages directory is at the top level, it's just going to be in the pages directory. We're going to find this app.js file, where I'm going to import that ClerkProvider at the top. Now, I don't have anything special going on inside of my app.js file right now, so I can just go ahead and copy and paste this example rather than trying to rewrite this out. But if we see a little before and after, we see right now I'm just passing in that component in my return statement, but as soon as I paste it in, all I'm doing is wrapping it with that ClerkProvider. Now at this point, if you open up your browser and refresh, nothing's going to be happening yet. You're not going to see anything visible because we haven't actually done anything to the app yet that's going to be able to give us those results. But you can see that if you search for Clerk inside of the network request, we can see that we are loading the Clerk API and the scripts. So that means we now have our Clerk instance set up and we're ready to go. So ultimately, we want to make sure that nobody can access this dashboard page unless they're logged in. On the quick start page, if we scroll a little further down, we're going to skip over the Clerk middleware right now, which we'll come back to later. But if we see the protecting pages part, we're going to scroll down where we can see that they're importing the ClerkProvider, a SignedIn component, a SignedOut component, and a RedirectToSignIn component, which probably sounds pretty self-explanatory, but we're going to use a slightly modified version of this. But generally what they're doing here is they're wrapping the entire application with this login and logout method, where what you want to do is, if you have pages that you want public, where it's going to be password protected by default, but what you would do is add it to this public pages array so that you can make sure that everything's protected unless you explicitly say that you want it to be publicly available. So starting off, we're going to import those same components from the Clerk SDK that they are in this example. And at the top of app.js, I'm going to replace that import statement, which is then going to additionally give me the signed in, signed out, and redirect to sign in. Now, instead of copying and pasting that full solution from the Clerk docs, we're going to slowly walk through this so that we can see what's actually happening. So the first thing we're going to do is we want to say that if somebody is signed in, we want to give that default experience. So I'm going to copy and paste that signed in component where I'm going to wrap that original default component saying that it's only going to become visible if somebody is actually signed in. Now, on the other hand, if somebody is signed out, we're going to now create that signed out component, but I'm going to say if somebody is signed out, I want to redirect them to the sign in page so that they have the opportunity to sign in. So again, this is going to be, if it's not a public route, it's a protected route, which by default, all of them will be. We're going to redirect them to a sign in page to give them the opportunity to actually log in. If we head back to our browser, we might actually see that the Next.js application already was refreshed by Next.js because we saved those changes. And we can see that we were redirected to our sign-in page like we expected because all of our pages require authentication. But we can see our configured providers, including the Google account or Twitter account, or that we can enter in our email address if we want, where we would get emailed a verification code if we tried to log in with that. Now we can see that that is the case. If I try to go to localhost 3000 again, if I try to go to the page, we can see as soon as it loads, it redirects us to that page. But we only want that to happen if we go to /dashboard, right? Where we can see that it's going to do the same thing and redirect, but we want that homepage to actually be available for us. So before we try to sign in, let's see what we can do to make sure that homepage remains public. Now back inside of our code, if we think about how this code flow looks, we have the signed in and signed out components, which are doing their own thing, but we want to bypass this entirely. And we want to say, if we have this array of pages that we expect to be public, we want them to just bypass the authentication. So that means we're going to check and see if the current path name using Next.js router is in that list. We're going to just return that component and say, we want to bypass that and we're ready to go. So to start, like I said, we're going to use the Next.js router. So I'm going to import use router from next router. Then at the top of this component, I'm going to say constant, and I'm going to destructure the path name from equals to use router. So this path name is going to have the value of the current path. So if we're on the home page, that's going to be just a simple slash. If we're on the dashboard page, that's going to be /dashboard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new constant called is public path. And I'm going to say, if this array includes the path name, then we have a public path. Right now, I don't have any pages, any paths set as public, but let's add in our home page because we want to say this array, if any of the items inside of this array, which is what includes is doing, if any of those items matches the path name, we want to say that we have a public path. But then inside of my ClerkProvider, I'm going to add a new statement and I'm going to say, if we have is public path and sign, I want to just return that component. Again, like I said, we're going to bypass any of the authentication logic. But I want to make sure that that authentication logic doesn't trigger when that's happening. So I'm going to add another statement. I'm going to say, if it is not a public path, by adding the exclamation mark, I'm going to say and again, and then we're going to have to use a React fragment because we're going to have two children here, but I'm going to copy and paste those right in. And we can say, if it is not a public path, we're going to kick back in that authentication logic. So now back inside of my app, we can see I'm still on the login page, but if I try to go to localhost 3000, we can see this time the page actually renders. Everything is working as expected. But if I click on the login button, we can see it's going to do the dashboard, but it kicks us over to the redirect page just like we expected. But I don't know about you, I think I'm ready to try to log in and see how this works. So for me, I'm going to try to log in with Twitter. So I'm going to click continue with Twitter. And once it had gone through that authentication flow, we can see that I was dropped back into the dashboard page. So that means that Clerk is recognizing that I'm authenticated. I can actually view this dashboard page, which is awesome. So this means my password protected page, I now have access to that because I authenticated and logged in. Now, if I try to go back to localhost 3000, we can see that that is a public page, but that doesn't matter. But if I click the login again and go back to the dashboard, we can see that Clerk still knows that I am authenticated for this page. Now, the tricky thing here is we have a login button, but how do we log out? Or generally, how do we see anything about the account that we're logged in? We want to actually be able to log out. We don't want to be stuck in this state forever. I'm going to head back over to the Clerk docs, and this time instead of the quick starts, I'm going to go to UI components, where we can see we have all these different components, including the sign in, redirect, the ones that we already worked with. But I'm going to go to UserButton, where what this is going to do is it's going to add a button that accesses my account when I'm actually logged into Clerk. And we can see that we can use that by importing it from the Clerk SDK, but then we can just simply drop it into our UI. So I'm going to copy this import statement, even though I know I'm not going to need all these different things. And inside of the header.js file, which is what shows that navigation at the top, I'm going to now import those Clerk components. Now, ultimately what I want is that user button. So I'm going to copy that name and I'm going to scroll down, and next to the login link, I'm going to duplicate that list item, and I'm going to simply remove that link, and I'm going to drop in that user button. Now, as soon as the page reloads, we can see that we now have this icon, including my Twitter profile avatar, which is for Halloween, which is right at the top here. And even if I click on this link, we can see this tooltip pop up that has my name, my username, and I can even manage my account. But importantly, we can now sign out of our account. So if I click sign out, we can see that it's going to redirect over to Clerk and give me that sign in page. That way, if I need to authenticate again, maybe I'm using a different account, I can. But instead, I'm just going to click localhost or go to localhost 3000. We can see that we're both back at the TV tracker homepage. And this time, if I click login, we can go right back and redirect it to this login page. Again, if I click continue with Twitter, we're going to go through that same authentication process, and it's going to drop me back inside of my application. And again, I'm authenticated. So we're looking pretty good, but if we look at this header, we see we still have both the login and this user button showing at all times. So we want to make sure that we only show those if the state makes sense to show those. So spoilers, while we're not actually going to use the ClerkProvider in the header.js file, we can still use the signed in and signed out components, which is exactly what we're going to do, where I'm going to wrap my login link with signed out. That way it'll only render if I am signed out. But then I'm going to also wrap the user button with signed in, and again, self-explanatory, it's only going to show that user button if I am logged in. In my app, we can see that I am now only showing that button. If I click sign out, we can see that I was dropped into the homepage still, but I now have my authentication cleared and I only see that login button. So this has worked out really well so far, and we had a way to add authentication easily to our application. But right now, we're only doing this client side. What if we want to make sure that we have our APIs locked down so that nobody can actually access them? While the information on this page is currently static, what if when the person logs in, we want to make an API request to dynamically get all those values so that it can be personalized to that user? So to see how this works, I'm going to create a new sample endpoint where we have this hello endpoint that just simply returns John Doe as an example, but I'm going to duplicate that and let's call it stats.js, where what we're going to do is we're going to still return that 200 status, but we're going to return a different object, which is just going to be some sample data. Where for instance, we can use the same data points. We have favorites, tracking, and watched. So I'm going to say favorites, we have 16 of them. Tracking, I have 6 of them, and watched, I have 3. If I now open up this API/API/stats, we can see that it's going to give me that data, and it's going to be exactly what I showed. Now, currently I'm logged into this, but what if I copy this and I open it up an incognito window, meaning that's not going to have any of my authentication? We can see that I can still see that data, and that's not a good thing because this is supposed to be personalized to my user account. Now going back to the quick starts and finding our Next.js quick start, the one thing that we skipped when we were going through here is we skipped the Clerk middleware. And what this middleware is going to do is it's going to use Next.js middleware, which is where we'll configure this. So when any request occurs inside of the Next.js lifecycle, including the API routes, what's going to happen is Clerk is going to attach itself. It's going to perform the logic so that it connects the dots and knows which authentication pieces it has to recognize when we try to use the Clerk SDKs inside of the API routes. Now inside of our code, the first thing we need to do is create our middleware file, which is going to give us the ability to actually attach the code to the Next.js lifecycle. Now the middleware file is going to be at the same level as your pages directory. So that means we're going to add it inside of the source directory. But again, if your pages file directory is in the root of the project, you'll be creating this middleware.js file in the root as well. But we're using it inside of the source, so we're going to add middleware.js to the source directory. Now this is what the basic middleware is going to look like, where we have our withClerk middleware, we have next response, which is going to be the default response object that Next.js gives us, but we can see that all we're doing is we're wrapping that middleware with Clerk. And what's going to happen is every time the request occurs, Clerk is going to step in and be the middleman so that it can connect the dots like we were saying. So rather than writing this all out by hand, I'm going to go ahead and copy this and paste it into my middleware.js file. But all we're doing is we're importing withClerk, we're importing next response from Next.js, and we're wrapping that middleware function with Clerk middleware. Once we're inside of that function, we're returning next response.next, which is just telling Next.js to continue on with the response chain. Now, this alone isn't going to do anything inside the application. What we need to do now is we need to check and see if we have our authentication set up. So what I'm going to do is we can either head over to API routes over here in the sidebar, but so that we can see what it looks like if we're looking this up, I'm going to go ahead and search in the docs. I'm going to say getAuth, which is going to be the function we want to use, but that's going to be located under API routes. So I'm going to go ahead and click that, and we can see we have an example right here, which is the function getAuth, which we're going to import again from Next.js server, which is going to give us the ability to get the authentication object that relates to our active user, and we're going to look for that ID. We're going to say if that user ID exists, we're going to let the API response actually occur. Otherwise, we're going to return an error saying that they're not authorized to view that route. So like usual, I'm going to copy this import statement for getAuth, and at the top of my stats.js API route, I'm going to import that getAuth function, and we can copy that other line too, where we're going to grab that user ID, and I'm going to paste it in right at the top of the handler function, where what we're doing now is we're running that getAuth function, which again, this is only going to work if we install that middleware, which we just did, but we're going to pass in the request object into that function so Clerk can actually read it, and we're going to then get the user object returned, which we're going to look for that user ID. So let's console log that user ID out and see what actually is happening. If I head into my browser, go to that API stats and actually refresh the page, and then I look inside of my terminal, we can see that that user ID was actually logged out because I'm requesting that from an authenticated session. Now you might be wondering what happens if we log out. So if I head over to the TV tracker application and I actually log out of my account, and I head back over to the API stats page, I'm going to then refresh the API route. We can see we still get that data because we haven't done anything. But if we look in the terminal, our user ID is null because we do not have an authenticated session. So back inside of my code, I'm going to say if I do not have a user ID, I'm going to return a response status of 401, which means unauthorized. It's an HTTP status code. And then I'm going to return JSON still, but I'm going to return a status property, and I'm just going to say unauthorized. Now we want to make sure that we also return after this response status, otherwise it might go through and have some unexpected results. But now once that API route refreshes, we can see we now get that status of unauthorized, which is perfect because we are not currently authorized. But if I yet again actually go through that authentication flow and log into my TV tracker application, I'm going to head over to that API route page. I'm going to refresh the page again, and we can see that I now can see that data because I am authorized. Now we're going to stop there, but if you want a more comprehensive way to check the authentication, we can do something similar to what we're doing inside of our app.js file, but we can do it inside of that middleware file where we can store all the different routes that we want to be public or not public, and we can add that logic inside of our middleware and make sure that we're returning a response based on that authentication status. But being able to easily add authentication like this to our Next.js application opens the doors for what we can actually do to build personalized and dynamic experiences for the web, where maybe now we can connect a database to the solution where we can do things like personalize the application, such as actually implement the favorites, the tracking, and the watched for our TV tracker application. Authentication is a critical component to be able to make sure that we're protecting our precious resources and be able to deliver engaging dynamic experiences, and we can make this all happen easily with Clerk. What kind of fun personalized experiences have you seen with authentication beyond just being able to simply log in for protected routes? What kind of personalization have you seen done before? Let me know in the comments. If you want to learn more about how you can use Next.js data fetching for building dynamic pages, check out my video, Create Pages and Fetch Data in Next.js using static and dynamic routes. Or if you want to learn how to take that dynamic data and actually use it to build custom SEO for your pages to show up on places like Google, check out my video React SEO with Next.js, where I teach you about dynamic SEO meta tags. Thank you, Clerk, for sponsoring this video, and if you like this video, make sure you hit thumbs up, subscribe, and click that little notification bell for future web dev content. Thanks for watching.